right, Feisties, we're back, kind of. This is Kelly O'Mara, Sara Gross here.
Hi, everybody.
And I feel like we need to say, first off, yes, the Feisty Triathlon podcast went dark back in December because we were going to relaunch with like a new website, a new podcast, a new, like, all this new stuff this spring. This is not it. Like, we promise that it is better.
We definitely have some amazing new hosts for the podcast
lined
up. We have a launch planned for about 2 weeks from now. So we're still super, super excited about that. But then sometimes, Kelly, shit happens.
Right. We were like already, I was going to say we were like going to tease this like big, like new exciting announcement. And then that is not Sara and Kelly. I feel like I need to be clear. Like, that is not the new podcast. It's better. It's better than that.
I mean, is there better than that? But sure.
We were all ready to tease it, and then some other news came this week from Ironman.
Before we go there, Kelly, can I just say we need a lighthearted moment here, and I know you're going to hate this, which is kind of why I'm saying it. Okay. But might I say your postpartum hair is looking really lovely today. Yes.
I actually tried to schedule a haircut, and it's like a whole thing because you can't like take your kid to get your haircut because he's only 10 weeks, and so you're like,
yeah. These all the problems. Yeah.
This is why women don't do triathlon.
Yeah. I can't figure out timing to get a haircut. I'm Ironman not on the cards right now.
Right. Yeah. And I will say, I am like on the this will be shocking to anyone who knows me, far end spectrum of like willing to leave my kid with anyone and like go and do stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You are. I can attest to that. Mm-hmm.
Right. So if I'm like, I probably can't leave him in the car, right? Which I know you can't. Like, I'm not going to leave my kid in the car.
Don't write us in. She knows that.
Don't message me. Then, like, then nobody is, right? If I'm like, I don't think I can, then nobody is.
Yeah, and I mean, just a great example of, like, some of the barriers that prevent women from taking on a big thing like Ironman, and then, like, as we'll get into later, like, once someone does, considering it kind of like a one and done, or maybe taking a break between taking that on again, seems utterly reasonable.
And you're like, and we have help, and my parents moving here, and me and my husband like split the night shift, so I've been getting plenty of sleep. Like, all these things are like way on that end.
Yeah.
And still I'm gonna exercise 4.5 hours this week, and I'm like, whoa.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, we're glad that you made time for this.
Yes.
Kelly. And before we get started too, I just want to apologize to everyone if it sounds like I am recording in a construction site. It's because I am. So before we hit record, Kelly was hearing, I can't hear it because of my headphones, but Kelly was hearing like trucks backing up and beeping and noises. So anyway, if you wonder what that is, there's construction happening right outside my office. So here we are.
For the new podcast, we'll also have solved that problem, just so you know. But we did get a lot of requests after Ironman announced yesterday that they were kind of like going back to a one-day championship, men and women together in Kona, going back to awarding slots proportional, which is the term in triathlon, but like based on participation rates, which we can get more into. We heard from a lot of people who were like, we need an emergency podcast, get the gang back together. And I gotta say, well, everyone has jobs and stuff, so we couldn't get the whole gang back together. But
right. And we did, I mean, we heard from I don't know about you, Kelly, I'm sure that you did, but I heard from a lot of people, both like messaging me and also like sharing things on Instagram stories and just like, I'm so sorry, why are they doing this? I think there's like, and we'll talk about this later, but I think a lot of the arguments around proportional representation at a world champs versus equal representation is like a very triathlon argument. Like this does not happen in other sports. So a lot of people are just sitting there going, equal is equal. What's the problem here? So yeah.
So I think we should start from like why we're so frustrated, right? Like why we both got off. We had this call with the Ironman CEO on Tuesday who told us kind of what was coming. And I think we also sort of saw that coming after we like met with him back in the fall. And like this wasn't a total shock, but it was like a little bit surprising. Like, and we felt so frustrated. And I think we need to start with why we felt so frustrated. And it's not because like we're anti-Kona. Like you were explaining to him, like, look, I've been to Kona 20 times. Like I know, like I like Kona, right? Like I know how this goes. So it's going back to Kona, and that's one thing, and that's like fine, like totally, like I understand the appeal of Kona. It's going back to one day, even though in their own poll, like the biggest preference was for 2 days. That was the number one pick, but they're just like logistically, operationally, they say they can't do it. It's going back to one day, which means men and women kind of together in the same race. And they're saying they will like solve the problem of like men interfering. They haven't told us how. Like maybe they will, right? They said they're going to do that. And then it's also going back, and this was not in their press release, so we had to ask, but it's also going back to, it was kind of equal slots the last 3. Like,
yeah, there was definitely like a move towards equal slots. Like I couldn't quite keep up with how that was
changing.
Changing or happening, but there was definitely that idea that like that we were moving in this direction of women having equal slots at their own world championship. And just to your point there too, like in the press release, for anyone who actually read the press release and thought this is actually not about, the press release isn't about equality versus proportionality, which is obviously the part of it that we were pulling out. But like if you had to literally read this whole press release that was, yay, we're going back to Kona, completely understand lots of people are excited about that. It was like in the FAQs at the bottom. Where you're like as if the most important question to a lot of age group women is not going to be like, then how do we qualify for this new championship? And are some of these new slots going to be for us?
Right. So it's going back to a system where it's based, and I feel like sometimes we say proportionality and we assume everyone, because that's like so common in triathlon. To explain, it's going back to be like very clear. It's going back to a system that's based on how many people start on like your race day, like how many other athletes there are in your category will determine how many spots there are.
Just
not
for
a
the...
system.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was like, not a system of like the fastest 10 men and the fastest 10 women in every like get to go, right? Like not like it's based on how many athletes there are overall, right?
Yes. Do you remember? And this is for the age groupers, not the pros. Right. And I'm just having a little flashback to the days when we had that same qualifying for the pros. And I can remember one day, actually at Ironman Arizona, being sick, waking up. I was sick the day before. I knew I wasn't going to race. But if I got up, put my wetsuit on, got in the water at 7 a.m. and started, like in my chip started, then one more pro woman would get to go to the world championship, which I think just kind of exposes how utterly ridiculous that system can be sometimes.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I think to get to like why we're so frustrated, if I was trying to explain this to my husband, right? Like, if Ironman just come to us or come to everyone and been like, look, we were hit hard by the pandemic. We have, like, it's been tough. Like, it's hard to make this work. We're, like, they're definitely getting pressure from a board, from finances, like, operations. You'd be like, okay. But they didn't. What the CEO said to us and what the arguments that are being made are the same ones that have been being made for 15, 20 years. And I think what's been really, really frustrating is we all engaged in that conversation about why women deserve equality in good faith for a decade, 2 decades, kind of like depending on how long you've been around, right? Like we like really sat down and genuinely believed that people didn't understand that like this is how it works in every other sport, that like when you give women opportunity at the top level and you acquire resources, like they rise to that occasion, that if you just do it by proportionality, it locks in place existing inequities, like that we can look at other sports. We really like engaged in that conversation for a long time. And it's exhausting. And it was like a full-time job doing for free for like many of us for a long time. And it really felt like we had made progress, right? Like we came out of that women's Kona really feeling like we did, right? Like we did it.
Right. So you're saying like I guess a year and a half ago in Kona coming to, like first it started with the 2-day, which I did, which kind of had that same feel like when Chelsea crossed the line first, right? And then the second year when we had the women's only Kona, and it really was like it was a full field. First of all, for a lot of the folks who are saying that not enough women take up spots, not enough women took spots in Nice. It's because it was Nice. But in Kona, women took their spots, right? And just even the vibe of having a woman cross the line first, having the media be all on them, everything about it was so, so special.
And like it felt like we had finally made all this, like people were finally like had listened, right? And we had chipped away and we had made all this progress. And like sure, like there were people who still wanted like the men and women to be in the same location on different days. Like sure, there were still like all these issues, but it felt like we had like made this incremental progress. And then to be back sitting with the Ironman CEO in Nice last fall, and you were talking and he was like telling us stuff, and you said something about like, well, equal spots are important. And he said, but what is equality really?
Right.
And then he sat there and proceeded to explain to you and I proportionality, as if it was a new concept, as if we had never heard this idea before, and he had just figured out this thing that was more equal than equality. Like, wait till you hear this brilliant idea.
Yes.
And I was so floored, right? I think that feeling of like, oh fuck, like we're back, exactly where we started, is why I was hearing from so many women being like, I'm so tired.
Yes.
I'm so tired of this.
And I think, so that the time when Scott said, what is equality anyway? And you and I both kind of internally clocked that we were likely going to go backwards on this thing. Yesterday, I heard, near the end of our conversation, I heard Scott's frustration around his feeling that you and I weren't listening to him, and he was listening to our points and we weren't, which was like kind of interesting to me, because I was like, oh, I don't think there's some level on which that entire history isn't in our current conversation.
No, he doesn't know it.
Right. Where I'm like, oh no, like I could probably make if I was in debate club, I could probably make the case for proportionality better than almost anyone, right? Like,
sure.
I fully understand why some folks think that represents a meritocracy, in terms of like, well, then it's not easier for the women to qualify than for the men. Like, I fully understand these arguments. I just simply do not think that that's the way to create depth in the women's field. Like, if you seriously want women to be 50% of your race, at some point you have to invest in that on every level, and in particular in this case on the slots. So yeah,
it was a little, besides the fact that I think we both like sat there jaw of it, it was also very clear, and it's been clear in a number of conversations with him, that there has been a lack of institutional knowledge transfer, both in the new CEO at Ironman and like some new officials, and in kind of coming out of the pandemic. There's been like a wave of new athletes, new podcasts, new YouTubes, new everything. And there's all these people that just like it's as if triathlon started for them in 2021. And they have like no information. Like Scott on Tuesday also said, oh, we just added an Olympic distance race to our new 70.3 to get women into the sport. We have short course. We've never done that before. And I was like, they literally doesn't know. They used to have an entire series of Olympic distance races.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying he like clearly didn't know that.
Yeah. Or that, and I think there's some other points that, like, I did a lot of research on this the first time around. So like I wrote a 5-part actual series about like the history of gender equality in triathlon and the forward and backwards progress there. We have a great history of like equality in triathlon, like we had equal prize money pretty much across the board from the beginning. There are some exceptions, but that's because of advocacy work of people in particular like Aaron Baker. But like even asking that request from the pros for a fair race that's not interrupted by the men dates back to Aaron Baker and Paula Newby-Fraser, right? Like in the late 80s. Right. They were like, the number one thing for them was not the lack of other women around them, right? Which is kind of what I feel so passionate about, but was actually like, oh no, we want a fair race. And so like it took us until they were asking in the late 80s, and now in 3 years ago, what is that, like 2021? We got it,
So there's this long pause for me and Sarah right now, because we're just like, oh, that's sad. But so part of me is like, all right, Sarah, let's do it one last time.
Right.
Let's tackle these arguments in good faith.
Sure.
Because I will say that I saw them being made again yesterday, like in triathlon comments on forums, and I have like no energy or desire left to engage again on the same thing.
Oh, this is what I was gonna say. Yeah, this is what I was gonna say. We will kind of make all of the arguments. But I had this dream last night where it's like it was kind of a waking dream. So I was kind of, when you start to be able to control your dream moment. And like I was sending an email to Andrew Messick, and the email just said, "Did you read him the Riot Act?" Like, because we've had these conversations before, right? Like, somebody could have told somebody how this goes. Anyway.
Yeah. So, Sarah, ready? Why do we
but let's go.
Why do we need slots to be equal?
Right. So I think the most important point here for me is that this argument for proportionality is in a sports context, is unique to Ironman triathlon. right?
Like not even nowhere else.
Not even unique to triathlon. Like in world triathlon, I can remember when I started as a pro athlete and there were like other people around me going to, then it was like ITU World Cup races, coming back and saying there were 4 women on the start line and 40 men on the start line. And that's back in the day when the prize money rolled up. So those 4 women who showed up got paid more money and the men were pissed, right? Like this did not suit them, but World Triathlon stuck by this. And now I don't think anyone would argue that the women's field has, at the elite level, has less depth than the men's. And even in age group, the knock-on effect, because that's kind of what we're talking about, is amateur triathlon, right? Like the knock-on effect. So like when you look at the stats, there are more women doing shorter distance. And there's a lot of reasons for this. It's not just about slots, but you know, there are more women doing shorter distance triathlons than
at the age group world championships in ITU or whatever it's called now, World Triathlon, you qualify the 5 best women and the 5 best men in every age group at nationals. That's just how it is, right? Like, and those are the 5 best women, and they compete against the other best women from other countries, and that's it. And it doesn't matter like how many slower men from Germany there are for how many like women from the US, right? Like it doesn't matter because the women's race and the men's race are separate, are like distinct, and you send your best in each, and that's that, right? And that's how every other sport works, right? Like I know you did a whole PhD in this, and someone sent me one weird example once where it was like badminton used to do, but there's like no other sport that does a system
I couldn't
that's
find
based
one.
on like that's based on participation.
It's based on participation. Also because the participation is an extremely flawed argument if increasing depth is what you actually want. But I think the reason why I think that sport broadly understands that women have been held back by a bunch of historical and cultural and systemic constructs, right? And if you want to create the space for women to like fill in that gap, you have to offer the opportunity first, right? And typically in most sports, you don't get a lot of argument back on that. Like, I think that's why I'm hearing from people outside the sport. Like, I go to my CrossFit gym this morning and they're like, what is happening over there? Like, and I'm like, proportionality, man. I don't know. Like, we're gonna have to write and record and talk about this for another how many months. But like, to outsiders, that is what makes sense, because also we've seen like the proof is in the pudding. Like that's what works. That's what worked with Title IX. That's what worked in our own sport with the World Triathlon, and not to mention the 70.3 Worlds, which we've talked about before. Do you remember the same things they were saying? The 70.3 Worlds, like they're giving out when it first started in Clearwater. I think it was Clearwater. Yes. And they were there for like 3 or 5 years or something, and people were like, it's a joke. They're handing out slots like candy, and now you have very competitive men's and women's races at 70.3 Worlds, right? So, like, come on.
Yeah, because like what you're getting at is that one of these arguments about why we shouldn't have equality at the top level in long course triathlon is because the women aren't good enough, right? Like they don't deserve it. Like there's not like, and you have all of these, and I remember 10 years ago, like people again, like engaged in that argument in good faith, and there were charts like comparing like the 37th man to the 12th woman, and like how is that like, and people made these like depth of field analyses, right? Like because you were trying to meet people where they were at, and you were like genuinely engaging that debate. And I'm obviously sort of hung up on like it doesn't matter, right? Like it doesn't matter if the 7th woman is as good as the 12th man. Like they're separate races, they're not racing against each other. But what you're trying to get at is this whole point of like, even if you acknowledge that, you say, okay, like there is a little bit of a gap, and like the women have historically not had an opportunity to do triathlon, and maybe there aren't as many mid-pack athletes in the women's race as there are in the men's race. We don't solve that by giving them less opportunity, right? Like when we talk about this whole like, oh, it's equal opportunity, that means that you're starting to count opportunity at the start line. Like you're saying all the things before that don't matter.
Yes, that's very well said. Yes. And I think it's like, are you creating opportunity by offering something like less, like by not offering people something to aspire to? Of course not. That's not how it works. And I think there is a logic to, if you want to have 50% of your field be women, right? Your proportionality, I don't know what you call that. It's like a very easy proportionality like calculation. It's like you should offer then your slots proportional to how many women you want there, aspirationally, not how many women actually already exist. Because if you do it, how many women are already there on the start line, it's just a, like, returning circle. Like, you're just going around in circles, basically. You're not actually growing the sport.
And to your point, like, we know this, and this is where, like, I got very frustrated with these surveys and this polling that was like, well, people feel like it's okay, and people feel, it doesn't matter, right? Like, we know, we don't need to ask how people feel, right? Like, we know it works because it's worked in every other sport. We know, like, in Title IX, the U.S., like, mandated equal access and equal funding for girls and boys sports, right? And you had all the same arguments. It was like, well, there's so many fewer girls, to give them the same amount of playing time as, like, in the gym as the boys will take away time from the boys. That's not fair. That's not fair. That's not proportional. You had all of this stuff that, like, I mean, at that point, it was literally like, should we give them gym time and locker room space, right? Like, should we give them this equipment? Well, then we won't have, like, money for the boys' equipment, right? Like, and yet it was a law, so they had to do it. And then the girls came and did the sports, and then then, you know, the scholarships were mandated to be equal, and people fill those spaces, and they rise to fill those spaces, and that's literally the reason the U.S. participation remained so much better than every other country for so long, right?
Yeah, I remember being in a women's studies class one time where I was quite shocked. Like, it was kind of about how change is made, you know, and I remember, like, naive me sort of, I think, thought that, like, once you had mass cultural, and this is true to some extent, like, once you had mass kind of cultural agreement on a sentiment, then the lawmakers, like, had to change it, as if they're the last resort, the last stage in change making. I think that's kind of how my 20-something-year-old brain thought about change making. And actually, like, in a lot of cases, it's the opposite. Right. It's that, like, a smaller advocacy group actually is making an argument that the leadership believes is the right direction for society, in the case of Title IX, right? Or for, like, the education system and the way that we're funding programs, and then puts a law into place. And once it's codified in law, then you start to see, like, then policies have to change inside the university, et cetera, et cetera. So, like, oftentimes, like, the rule comes first, the policy comes first, and then the cultural change kind of catches up. Like, definitely there's something in the zeitgeist going on, and people are talking about, like, people were talking about equal access to education in the 70s, right? Like, in the 60s and 70s, that was the massive conversation in women's rights movements. And then it had that knock-on effect for sport. Right. So I think I look to, like, for another example, internally, and this affects triathlon, massively, is, like, the Olympic Games in the 90s put into place mandates that was, like, aiming for a gender equal games, which we saw come to fruition in Paris last year, where we were, right? But it started in the 90s, which with rules for countries about, like, for example, like, what new sports were allowed in, right? So, and this is where it, like, tangentially affects triathlon, because triathlon had this wildly fast trajectory from, like, new sport to Olympics. And that's what actually grew the sport of triathlon, is the Olympic Games. Like, people actually saw it for the first time often in the Olympic Games and went, what is that? And boom, like, we had a real sport. And it's because, like, in the 90s, they were mandated that new sports had to have, like, an equal depth in, like, men's and women's, or had to have, like, a women's side of their sport that was well developed, right? There were rules around that. They had to have enough countries that had well developed women's sides of the sport. And triathlon just doubled down on that and went, okay, this was one of the ways, like, they created the format where you go around in circles and it's good for TV. But also this was a really important part of us getting into Olympic Games, was that, like, we had to have, and so what did they do to create that depth in the women's field? They created opportunity for women to go to these World Cups. They funded it, right? And they were able to make an argument to the IOC that the women's side of the sport was as well developed, or was developing in a quick enough trajectory to make it worthy of an Olympics. And then we were there in the 2000, and then literally, and Ironman has most certainly benefited from that legacy as well. Sure. And I think we forget that, and we forget how it happened. We forget that it was equal opportunity that made it happen. Sorry, I'm on my soapbox now, so I'll let you talk.
No, it's true. It's and now the Olympics, like, it's not an accident that the Olympics are, historically, is that starting to change, the biggest stage for women's sports, and that female athletes are as popular in the Olympics. Like, you looked at, like, it was something like the 3 or 4 of the 5 most popular athletes this last Olympics were women. And that's not because like we went around and we're like to all these like beginners and we're like, hey, let's explain the Olympics, right? You know what I'm saying? Like we didn't start at the bottom. That's this idea in triathlon, is that we have to go on and start at the entry points, right? And you don't. That's not like how that works.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting point here too, because we're using Title IX, which affects university sport, which is kind of elite sport, or like mid-range, and then I'm talking about Olympics, which is obviously quite elite sport. The pros now in Ironman still have the equal slots, which is very interesting, because why? Like, if proportionality is so damn good, why do the pros not have it? Obviously, I'm not arguing for that, but like, come on. Like, obviously there's this recognition that we need to have equal access for the pros on some level. Okay, so now why the elite age groupers don't have the same opportunity, right? So this is a question that I don't know who could answer. But I think we can also look to for example, like a lot of the major marathons where you have qualifying systems. And like, can you imagine the uproar if Boston back in the day, because now more than 50% of runners are women, right?
Sure. So, and Boston's like 42%, 45, 55, like it's like 45% women, 55, something like that.
Yeah.
Around there. Yeah.
And so can you imagine like the uproar, like, 10, 15 years ago, if they'd been like, well, we're doing it based on proportions. Right? If you convince more of your neighbors to go out and run, create a mom's running group, go for it, and then therefore we will have more slots at the Boston Marathon. Like it doesn't make a ton of sense.
I will say this is maybe the first time I've ever loved something that came out of a Slow Twitch forum, but somebody sent me this yesterday from the forum, that somebody had posted a graph of participation rates at Boston from the very beginning of like men versus women. And women weren't allowed to run marathons till like 1978. Like, they literally weren't allowed, right? And then they started being, like, let them in. And you can imagine those first so many years, the women's line was still like tiny. It was still like very small. And now it's about 50-50, right? That's skyrocketed. And the person said, this feels kind of like if in 1981 Boston was like, well, see, we let women in. They just don't like marathons.
It 100% feels like that. And I think that's another one of the counterpoints that we need to address here, right? Is that we had, like, over the last 3 years, and this is another one of Scott's points that came out of his polling, that we let women have close to equal spots again for the last 3 years, and a lot of women left, right? Like, more people were leaving. More people in general, I think, were leaving because it was like, because Ironman tends to be, and especially world champs level, it tends to be like a one and done. Like, you have this life goal and you get there, right? And then you take a break. Makes sense, right?
Even Ironman will confirm it. Like, their own polling says in the year after someone does a world championship, they step back from the sport. Sometimes they come back and they double down, and sometimes they leave for good. And that's like, that is across the board. That's not like unique. But to get very triathlon specific, one of the arguments they've been making is that number skyrocketed with women since we gave them equal days, since we gave them equal slots and more slots. It was, and to quote, too easy for them to qualify. And so now they're leaving the sport, and we have inadvertently decreased like the number of people in sport. And the problem with that is, he told us this in Nice, and he repeated it on Tuesday, and he's repeating it now to other people. That's 2 data points, right? Like, that is 2 cycles, like 1.5 given when you count. Like,
right.
And so all you're really saying is that women who did Kona in 23 didn't come back to Nice in 24.
Right.
And then reverse, you're like, well, see, men had a pickup. And so all you're really saying there is like, men who did Nice in 23 did Kona in 24. And I think we can all, if you're in triathlon, recognize the problem, the confounding variable with that.
Which is like, everyone wants to do Kona.
Right. So, as I said also to somebody yesterday, right? Like, the problem that sports are famously too easy for women, and so they quit, right? Like, that's definitely, what happens.
Yeah.
It's not. That's sarcasm.
And I think, the follow-on point I wanted to make from that is, like, yes, we had 3 years of women having more access to a world championships. And prior to that, we had 50 years of, I actually, and I need to look this up, I meant to, but like when the qualifying actually started for Kona, like there would have been a number of years when Ironman World Champs first started where like you didn't have to qualify.
Yeah, there's
right?
like, yeah.
And I'm pretty sure, but I'm not 100% on this, that from when the qualification started, it was a proportional qualification.
Well, at first, I like went down this whole too, because you used to just have to like mail your check in and like write a story.
Yeah.
And then it was like a lottery. It was literally just sort of like a lottery type system. And then there was a qualifying, and you like qualified at like an Olympic distance. Like, because Karen Smyers told me about this. She was like, I went and did, you know, this race, and like, oh, you got a spot to Kona. And at first, and like early on, I think if you were a woman and you like wanted to do it, you kind of just could, because they're like Karen Smyers was the only woman. You know what I mean? Like it was like her and Ann Head, you know? And so it only became kind of once it got overly impacted. Yeah. I think like early 90s, like around 2000s, that they had to come up with like this system of qualifying. Right. And that's where it starts to get into this whole, there's no more room on the pier debate.
Right. The proportional qualification. Yeah. So in any case, we have, you know, say 20 to 30 years of a proportional qualification system that also, compared to 3 years, not even 3, as you say, like 2 qualifying years of a almost equal access system. And those, first of all, aren't comparable. And secondly, like, you can't argue that the latter didn't work if you don't also argue that the former, the proportionality, also did not work for increasing women's participation in Ironman.
And when he made this argument to us in Nice in September, I said, well, what about 70.3 worlds? Because you have 10 years of data or something like around that, 8 years, since you gave women their own race there and increased the number of spots. Is the same thing true there? Do women not return? And I don't like it. And like, they hadn't pulled the number. They were like, oh, that's a good question. We'll look into that. And I don't think they ever did. Yeah. But that would be a much better example, because you have like a longer record. Or to your point, as we keep looking at other sports and this like concept that once you have to give equal access at the highest level, and there's a gap. There's often always a gap a little bit, and then people catch up. I look at like March Madness is very US. Like, I don't know if anybody watched some of the early playing games. Like, some of those were like UConn won by 80 points. You know what I mean? Like, but they'll catch up. And like, or you look, I always use soccer, right? Because soccer is the sport in the US that, with a combo of Title IX and then the US women, and then the US women were so much better. And then they won in 99. You had like this wave of girls who have always played soccer, right? And they like, and there's a whole other thing about how like our university system is like a development system for the world. Yeah. Or it has, and they were so much better for so long. And they're used to, and then when they increased the number of teams at the World Cup, the US would win by like 10 points or something, right? Like, it was like ridiculous. And then and then what happened is all these other countries that have soccer infrastructures, Europe, England, Spain, right? They realized that they care about soccer, and they could just like fund women's pro leagues. And so all these European women's pro leagues are relatively new. They're like 6, 5, 7 years old. Yeah. And they just started like paying like women's equivalent of Euro League. And it rose so fast that we went from, it was like one World Cup cycle from when the US won like 9-1 to the US like getting out in the quarterfinals. Right. Because all you had to do was like provide the elite pro opportunities and other places, and it caught up. And I was joking to you, you know what they didn't do is go around Europe with like how to play soccer clinics for girls. Right? Like, they didn't like say like, you know what we need to do? We need to start at the beginner level.
Yeah, we need to. Well, it wasn't like one had to precede the other, right? So like, yes, like beginner clinics for girls soccer in places where girls don't have access to that, super important, right? But that is not, this is like a top-down, bottom-up solution if you truly do want more women in your sport and more women staying in your sport, right? I think a point, I don't even know if we're on the run list anymore, Kelly. A point you made earlier, which I think is actually quite remarkable, which I'm surprised that no one saw before you mentioned it, is that like when they polled that 42% of women actually preferred the new Nice Kona format, like getting 42%
into their survey number.
The survey, yeah, sorry, I'm into their survey because like obviously there was a lot of weight put onto this survey in this decision making and the rollout of.
And I think there's a whole argument about whether or not you should be making decisions via online polls. Like, that's not like how we should decide equality. Like, part of me keeps being like, no matter how much we poll, like 2 doesn't equal 3. Like, it doesn't matter what people. But that's a separate.
That was like, I forget whether I just thought it or said it on our call with Scott yesterday, but I was a bit like, you're not like, you're not like a representative in government who has to represent your people and needs to understand like what your people want so you can bring that, like, where that's your job. That's not the job. The job is like, well, the job is lots of things that I don't even know, but one of the things of the job is like to decide about what you want for the sport, what's best for the sport, what the future of the sport looks like, right? Sometimes despite what some of your constituents think.
Right. But he was very, I mean, he was very hung up on like, and I think it comes again from he has no background in triathlon. He doesn't know anything about triathlon, like, and that's fine, like totally like fine. But so he came in and was like, I'm going to educate myself about triathlon, which again is like completely admirable. Yeah. But again, like, it seems that all of his knowledge starts in 2021. Like, there is very little knowledge before that, short of like the Bob Babbitt speech about the start of Kona that we've all heard. And so so they were very hung up on like, we're going to do these polls. We're going to ask people what they want. And so they were sharing these numbers about whether people, as the survey they sent around had like, do you want 2 days in Kona? Do you want 1 day in Kona? Do you want 1 day in Nice and 1 day in Kona? Do you want 2 days in Nice? Do you want 1 day in Nice? Do you want it to road? Like, it had all these options.
The survey was very flawed. Like, do you recall? It didn't actually let you choose. Like,
it was very.
It was one at a time. It was always like this or this,
which is how you do. This. That is how you should do forced choices. Like, that is a thing in polling. But and so overwhelmingly, when they've like glossed over this fact, the number one pick in their own survey was 2 days in Kona. Like, that just is true. Then they're just kind of like, well, we can't do that. The number 2 pick was 1 day in Kona, and then everything else was lower. And they will say that this shows that people, men and women, wanted to race together. And you're like, well, they didn't pick 2 days in Nice. They didn't pick 1 day in Nice. They didn't pick. Yeah. It actually shows that they wanted to do Kona. Like, that's a separate, like, that's a side point.
100%.
But then they put out these infographics, and they're like, overwhelmingly people preferred 1 day in Kona. That's what they're saying. They like put out these charts, and the asterisk there is preferred to, compared to 1 day in Nice and 1 day in Kona, right? Like, compared to the current setup. And then they had all these stats, and the one that he kept saying to us was like, well, even age group women, 58% of age group women prefer 1 day in Kona. And all I could think was, you had 4 decades of the Kona like myth operating, right?
Yeah.
And after 2 years, 42% of your female customer base already prefers this other thing.
Yeah.
Like, that's actually like not great for you.
That's huge news. Yeah, that's like, yeah.
Because what you should use opinion polling for isn't to like just implement decisions. It's to watch how opinions shift. Like, that's what you use opinion polling for in actual like real industries. Like, not in is to like see how opinions are changing and customer preferences are changing.
Right.
And to me, that's like, what you have here is a problem.
Yeah. And probably a huge shift from if they had polled, I'm going to guess, because do you remember when they first announced the Nice thing? Like, there were very few people who liked this idea. You know, like, but we don't really know because they didn't do polls then. Sure. But yeah, great point, Kelly.
And you should ask, why does almost half of your female customer base have this underlying like about your iconic product? And if you were going to ask, I think it's probably something you and I know, which is that like the age group women's race there, it's like kind of a miserable experience, right? Like, sure, the whole like the myth is fun, being in Kona is fun. But being out there and getting swarmed by hundreds of age group men and not having a clean race is not super fun. Like, I have no desire to do that again. And you actually did try to bring this up to Scott, and you said, oh, so you're going to try and make sure the pro women have a clean race, but the age group women won't. And he just like literally didn't understand your point. Like, I'm not saying he just like didn't know what you were talking. Like, he was like, why not? I don't.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like, not understanding what it's like out there because and I do think like until you see it or experience it, like, you really don't understand what it's like to have like a pack of 100 men coming by you at like 50 k's an hour on the Queen K, and then your choice, and that's usually a couple other women sprinkled in with them, right? So then you're in there, you see people cheating. No one's stopping them. You're having like, I don't, maybe this is just me, but like this like crisis of ethics. Like, cause now
I almost started to cry out there. I was like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, like now I have to, in order to not cheat, also allow people to come past me. It's like, you should not. I remember thinking I should not have to be making these choices in a world championship, and that is why the pro women in particular have been asking for a clean race for a really, really long time because they don't want to make those decisions either. They're fighting for money. This makes sense. It's their careers. But also, like, why should the age group women not be offered the same opportunity?
And I think, again, like, how did we end up back where we started? Why are we back making the same argument? And a lot of it is this, like, lack of institutional knowledge and this, like, kind of information echo chamber. And I think that we are suffering a huge amount from the fact that he never saw one day. Like, he just didn't a one day in Kona. He has no idea what we're talking about. And clearly, like, information didn't get passed on. I also think there's something, the fact that his first ever world championships was women's Nice, and then he went from that to men's Kona.
Yeah.
If it had been reversed, I think your impression would be very different.
Right. Well, I mean, and we talked about this at the beginning, but like, we all remember women's Kona. Like, we all had shivers. People were crying. Like, it was like, it was wild. Like, in that sense, like, I didn't expect to be so emotional. And that's what we heard from a lot of people in our community too. And I think the other thing, like, yes, you're absolutely correct that, like, having that historical data come into, or historical, I don't know what you call it, trajectory come into the decision making seems to be lacking a little bit. I also think that, like, in triathlon broadly, like, in Ironman triathlon broadly, we're not looking at, like, how the outside world is looking at women's sports right now, and maybe what has been learned in terms of, like, all this development we're seeing in women's sport has come from, like, money and opportunity just being poured in. And once women were in decision making seats, they made the decisions to allow for more women to participate, more leagues to spring up. Like, these are the things that are happening. And so to have that kind of rollback of, like, we're going to give equal access. Oh, oops, sorry, no, we're not, seems really completely off base, in particular in this environment.
Right. There's, like, larger cultural tensions would be the polite word, larger cultural, like, fights happening, and it's hard not to see this as one of those, kind of like, which direction do we go now, right? Do we go forward or backward? And I certainly think that this is part, like, wrapped up in all that. But one of the that's almost like a separate discussion that I spent a lot of time thinking about. But the argument we actually did try to make to him was, like, okay, but younger women, like, they're looking at this bigger, they're not, like, in the triathlon weeds. Like, they haven't had 30 years of Kona myth. The NBC special doesn't happen anymore. Like, they don't know what you're talking about. They operate in this, like, larger... They
live in the outside world that I just talked about. Yeah.
Right. And so they operate in this universe where they go, like, what? Like, of course there's equal spots. Like, of course the women's basketball is as interesting as men's basketball, right? Like, they operate in this universe where, like, they don't even know, like, they don't know what you're like, Ironman? Like, why is it not, why that's, what? That's not Ironman. Like, they don't, like, that to them, all of it sounds weird. And so you now are doubling down on something that doesn't make any sense to someone in their 20s.
Yeah.
And they're not, and you didn't poll them. You only polled your existing community. They're not going to come and argue with you about it. They're not going to do this thing we've been doing for 2 decades and engage in these, like, deep, good faith conversations kind of about, like, oh, well, there are so many men in Europe who can do a 450, like, but there aren't those equivalent mid-pack women. Like, they're just going to be like, oh, triathlon sounds dumb, and go do high rocks instead, right? Like, that's it. Like, that's what's going to happen. And so, and I was trying to explain this to him, like, you're never going to hear from them. You're just you're doing all the same things that were done for 20 years. Yeah. And you're just going to be like...
With all the same arguments.
With all the same arguments. And it's not going to work. I mean, I know there is, like, a whole effort within Ironman, a lot of women kind of really trying to work, and I understand that. Yeah. But it's probably not going to work because it hasn't worked before. And you're doing all the same things in a environment that has changed, that is even further from what you are operating. And they're not gonna, and then you're just gonna be like, why didn't it work? Why? Oh, well, women don't like triathlon. And that's just where you're gonna, and that's what's, like, so frustrating to me.
Yeah, the women who are affected the most are just outside the group that was polled. Yes. I think. Like, so they're the ones that, like, they maybe even knew there was a poll or something, but they, like, were too busy just trying to squeeze in their 12 hours of training a week to try to get to their first Ironman race and one day hope to qualify for a world championship, to, like, even think about answering a poll, let alone potentially even know about it, you know? So Yeah.
And you're not, and so that's what I kept thinking. It's like, when you talk about like where do we go from here, it's like, I honestly, like, from a triathlon standpoint, like, I don't know, right?
Yeah,
Like, I mean me personally, and this is like I personally have like almost no interest in doing triathlon, like, and that's not like because of the decision yesterday. It's just like, well, other things sound more fun. You could, like, there was something I used to always, like, at some point when I was racing pro, I would be out there on the course and I would think, I'm a smart person, I could get a real job. Like, there are lots of other things I could do with my time and energy. And I feel like that sort of, and that is partially to go back all the way to why we were hearing from other women yesterday. I think that's what a lot of women are feeling, is like, there's other things I could do. There's a lot of stuff out there now. There's like trail running and gravel races and and like, I could just, you know, and I think that's sort of like what's going to happen, right? It's like, I don't want to get my time trial bike out now to like spend hours on a trail to go to a thing where I'm sworn by men and have to like feel second class. Like, I'd rather not.
And can you imagine, I love that you brought up the example of high rocks, because that's kind of what I was thinking too. Like, just to give an example of like something that exists in our endurance sport world, because let's be real, it's more endurance than it is strength, and it's like just skyrocketing in popularity right now. Like, and can you imagine that race being like, well, it's more popular amongst men, so in order to create, we need a proportional representation in the way that we like do our races. Like, no, nobody thinks that's fair. Like, that would be wild and bizarre, right?
It would be wild, right?
And that's literally what's happening right now with Ironman.
So it's like a little, like, and I had a lot of people message me, and I think this is where we should like kind of try and end here, is that I had a lot of people message me yesterday that's like, well, what do we do?
Yeah, same.
Like, because, and I mean, like, as somebody who grew up in a household where my mom boycotted a lot of companies on principle, boycotts are hard to maintain. So I understand that people say like, I'm going to boycott, but it's hard when they like, when Ironman owns
and people really do want to do Kona.
Right.
Like,
right. So, but I had people literally say like, well, even if if I just like, I'm like, oh, I don't want to do Ironman races anymore, then female participation goes down, and they're like, oh, see, women, like, it's just like this circle. So like, you feel like, well, what do I do? And I don't know that I have any. So the only good solution I heard, and I mean, this is like assuming that you want to solve Ironman's problem for them, and I think we're both a little bit like, not my job anymore.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to solve Ironman's problem, the only good solution I heard was that one of these big investors that's putting a lot of money into women's sports these days should buy up like all the spots at Ironman Texas.
Oh, I thought of the same thing.
And then like run a foundation and like pay for women to go, pay for all their training, and then have like Ironman Texas be like 100%
women. I love that. I actually thought of it in a different sense. Like, I was like, oh, like in my musings of like, could money buy this, right? And like, you could buy like women's spots. Like, but I was thinking of it more of like, not all, but like, that would be hard to control, but like, just buy a ton of women's spots. And I thought it's so funny. We had the same thought.
Well, you could do one of these big, like, you know, like an Ally or a Gainbridge or like a Gate. Like, there's a bunch of companies that put a lot of money into women's sports, and you could have them just, and I mean, buying up all the spots in Texas and funding all the women to go is like a small change for some of these deals they're making. Like, we still operate in a triathlon world that's like small fucking change.
Right. It would be effective.
That would be something.
The other thing on a less, I don't know what that is, extreme level, is that, like, you know, clearly, and like, to his credit, like, Scott really values listening to his, like, the people in the sport, right? And I think he really has been making tons of effort to like get caught up on like what Ironman triathlon is, and like what is like the beating heart of Ironman. And so I think, honestly, like, hearing from people would help, right? Yes. Like, just understanding that, like, oh, maybe there was some flaw in the polling mechanism. Maybe there's some flaws in the thinking. Like, it's never too late to, like, run back the clock and create equality. Never too late.
I think that's a good point. I mean, that's where we should end, because I do think, again, like, one of the reasons we're in the situation we are in is a little bit like, he never saw a one day. He never saw women's Kona, right? Like, it's just sort of, but also people are a product of like who they are surrounding themselves with, right? And like who they listen to in an echo chamber. And I think when he came into triathlon and moved to Florida and like joined some of these like large old school, I think there's just like a lot of 50-year-old white guys that are talking to him. And then there's a whole dude podcast, YouTube ecosystem now. And I like a lot of those guys. Like, this is no hate on them, but they just sort of like promote and repeat each other, right? And it becomes this like self-perpetuating circle of like, we're all just saying, and then you start to be like, well, everyone's saying, because it just because it seems it's actually quite easy to take over an entire niche podcast infrastructure because they're not that big, regardless of what numbers they put out. Nobody is getting that big numbers. I know. And so what happened was that he got into that, and he just thought like because I remember one of the first conversations we had, he was genuinely surprised to find out that not everyone thought going back to a one day in Kona was a good idea. Like, he had never genuinely was like shocked to find out there was a whole bunch of people who would be like, So I think breaking through, and I don't know that we can, but I'm saying I think, to your point, anything that can break through that kind of echo chamber would be
and that's like, that comes back to like why it was really important for us to record today, and why it's important for us to like relaunch our Feisty Triathlon podcast in 2 weeks. Which
2 weeks on May 14th, we will be doing a live launch. We will have a lot of announcements coming out kind of next week. Guess who the hosts are going to be. So do mark it on your calendar. We will be coming back because a lot of people did say this was a really unfortunate time to have a extreme lack of women's voices. Part of me was like, that can't be all on us. Part of me was also like, we can't even get women to do triathlon. They have to do so much childcare and household. You want them to also start media projects? Jesus. That's a separate
and
point.
Case in point, like, as we were looking for hosts too, we're coming up against this and finding like, you know, well-spoken, high-profile people in the sport who really wanted to be part of our podcast as well, who were like, you know what, like, I have a lot on my plate, and a lot of that was to do with like childcare and other.
That was the biggest obstacle to getting people lined up. But we are not abandoning triathlon. We are coming back. And we are going to have a lot of different voices coming on, a lot of different interviews, a lot of different people. We also will be, you know, coming out with a lot of new stuff later this year. We will be back in Kona. I was saying our theme should be one last time, but
no, we're back, bitches.
That was originally our theme.
Like, we're back, bitches, you know?
So we are, you know, based on saying don't give up. You are also always a product of who you're surrounding yourself with. And sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, triathlon is mostly dudes, because I never really, it's not for me. So you can make your own little, you can also make your own little universe in triathlon,
of course,
of whatever you want it to be.
And I loved hearing from so many people yesterday that I haven't heard from in a long time. And yes, thank you all for your voices, and I fully support everyone's voice in this space at this time, as we seem to be sliding back a little bit.
Yes, and we will see you all in 2 weeks. Well, we won't, because we will have better hosts. It won't be us. And we will see you all in Kona. We'll be back.
Yeah,
bitches. One last time.
Yes.